740 or so years before the birth of Jesus, Jerusalem is a frightened, anxious city. The two small Jewish nations of Israel and Judah live in the shadow of the Assyrian Empire. Assyria is far larger and wealthier than Israel and Judah, with a much stronger army. Assyria has already conquered other nations in its relentless push for expansion. The question for Judah and Israel is not really whether Assyria will invade, but when, and how long it will take the Assyrians to overrun the Jewish people. Israel is first. The Assyrians invade in 732 BCE. 10 years later, the Israelite capital, Samaria, falls. Everything is over for Israel. The nation ceases to exist, and the Assyrians take the Israelites away into exile, where they are never heard from again. Future generations will call them the lost tribes of Israel. Judah and its capital, Jerusalem, seem to be next. We can imagine what it is like, feeling threatened and vulnerable, the energy and money pouring into building up the city walls, the automatic suspicion and hostility toward foreigners. Everyone in Jerusalem is on edge, waiting and dreading what the future will bring. In this anxious, fearful time, God's word comes to Jerusalem, to the prophet Isaiah. God's word comes to Isaiah about Jerusalem. God proclaims that the mountain of God's house, the Temple Mount at the center of Jerusalem, shall be the highest of all the mountains. All the nations, near and far, Jewish and Gentile, friend and enemy, shall stream to it. Jerusalem will be the place of all people's learning, the anchor of their faith, the focus of all their desires. Jerusalem will be the center of the world. Here, where God dwells, God will speak to all nations. God's word will sound out to all peoples. God will judge between peoples and nations. They will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. They will renounce war and turn toward growing food for hungry people. It seems completely unrealistic. Yet the people of Judah find it hopeful and life-affirming too. Their nightmare of anxiety and fear and threat of conquest is not God's will. It may be the Assyrians' will, but God's ways are not human ways, and God's thoughts are not human thoughts. God's will is peace, wholeness, justice, abundance, harmony. Isaiah's words encourage Judah and its people. Jerusalem finds the strength and courage to persevere until the Assyrian Empire suddenly weakens and the threat of conquest is no more. Jerusalem becomes a place of peace, as God dreams it can be. Many centuries later, 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, the small community of Christians in Rome is mired in conflict. These Christians to whom Paul is writing are Gentiles, non-Jews. They came to know Jesus and follow him through the Jewish community in Rome, many of whom have become Christians while remaining Jews. But now those Jewish Christians argue that the Gentiles aren't really Christians, that you have to be Jewish to be Christian. Both Jewish and Gentile Christians are a tiny minority in an overwhelmingly pagan city that regards them with hostility. When the authorities treat you as strange and dangerous, you need friends on your side to survive. And the Gentile Christians of Rome are losing their Jewish friends. It is a nightmare for them. They are alone and scared. They wonder how they are supposed to live now. The Apostle Paul writes to these Gentile Christians in Rome with his usual wise counsel. He reminds them of the command at the heart of both the Jewish law and the teaching of Jesus. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do that, always. That is how you are supposed to live. And remember, Paul says that in God's time, it is just before dawn. The world is emerging from its long night. The sky is growing lighter in the east, birds are chirping, and followers of Jesus are waking from sleep. The change that Jesus Christ brought is unfolding. It hasn't been completed yet, but change is happening. While you wait, Paul says, lay aside the works of darkness, drunkenness, wild parties, selfishness, petty arguments, and jealousy. Instead, put on the armor of light. Wrap yourselves in God's presence and protection. Trust that God's steadfast love will protect you until Jesus comes again and God's dream of peace, justice, wholeness, abundance, and harmony is finally here. The people of Judah in Isaiah's time, the Gentile Christians of Rome in Paul's time, were living in the tension between the nightmare the world often is and God's dream for humanity and all creation. I think all of God's people do that in every time and place. At times when the nightmare is closer and God's dream seems far off, as it did for our forebears, it's tempting to give in to despair, to the kind of fear that paralyzes us and makes us withdraw from each other. We might take the powers that be at their word, that violence, war, domination, and isolation are the way things ought to be. Yet through Isaiah and Paul and countless other messengers down through the ages, God proclaims that God's dream for the world is peace, justice, wholeness, abundance, harmony. And the dream is on its way. Change is coming. It's not here yet, but we can tell that it has already begun, as surely as the dawn rises in the east every morning. God shows us glimpses of the dream in this age, even as we wait for it to become real in all its fullness. That is the promise of Advent, the season of the church year that begins today. Advent is a curious time in some ways. In these 4 weeks before Christmas, we inhabit the space between Jesus' birth 2,000 years ago and his coming again in the future. We remember Jesus as an unborn child, even as we wait for the full-grown Christ to break into the world and make all things new. David observed a couple of weeks ago that the world is always ending. Jesus is always making it new. Happiness may not be permanent, but suffering is not permanent either. Both will come to an end. We live in the nightmare knowing that it is ending. We look with hope to God's dream of swords beaten into plowshares, of weapons remade as tools of peace. While we wait, we put on the armor of light, the defensive shield of prayer and trust in God and hope. We love our neighbor as ourselves. We stay as faithful as we can to Jesus and his teachings of truth and love. And we cling to that vision of nations streaming to Jerusalem to find peace, justice, wholeness, abundance, and harmony. Now and then the nightmare breaks and we catch glimpses of God's dream for the world. When Melville and I went to the Holy Land in 2019, the nightmare was definitely there. The Netanyahu government was treating Palestinians abominably. The threat of terrorism was ever present. And yet, the whole world was streaming to Jerusalem. The streets of the old city were filled with Jews and Christians and Muslims from every nation. Korean Christians and Somali Muslims and Canadian Jews joined the same lines for sesame bagels, cooed at the same street cats napping in the sun, prayed alongside each other at the Western Wall. In spite of the security fences and the metal detectors, it was a fulfillment of Isaiah's vision. Jerusalem was the center of the world. It has been so before. It will be again, for good this time, in God's good time. We hold that hope close to our hearts. We wrap ourselves in the armor of light, and we continue to love our neighbor until Jesus comes again to make all things new.